Dear Professor Esz, thank you so much that you agreed for this interview. It's a great honor to speak to you. I'm following your recent essays and articles, and also started reading your new book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe. And it's very interesting to see how you look into the history of Europe through the personal story, as it was also in the book, The File. But you also mentioned there that the period of post-war Europe was elusive, and this illusion ended with a full-scale invasion, with a full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine. So, can we say that the Russian invasion to Ukraine, full-scale war, was some kind of insight for Europe?
So, first of all, I think the 24th of February 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the war that follows, is going to turn out to be something as big in European history as 1989, except, of course, in a bad way, and as 1945. So what I argue in the book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, is that we have the post-war period, which is since 1945, and then the post-wall period, which is since after the Berlin Wall came down on the 9th of November 1989. And I argue that it's that period which has ended. I just have to turn off my voice recognition software, otherwise I'll be dictating to the world whatever I'm saying. And what I argue is that it's that period that ended, so that you have this period which goes from the 9th of November 1989 to the 24th of February 2022. And what the biggest illusion was that we had rarely reached a post-war period, that never again was war going to come back to Europe, despite the fact we had the wars in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, that we could take the peace dividend, spend much less than 2% of GDP, that security would be achieved by non-military means, that economic interdependence was a good thing, and therefore becoming dependent for our energy on Russia was fine because that would underpin peace. All those illusions, and that what really mattered was the economy, and all those illusions of the post-war period have hit the dust.
Yeah, but so now starts the new period, and how would you describe it? So would you, because in your lecture also, which you gave in Lviv and in Kiev, you say back, yeah, so the post-wall period, which ended, and back. So you're moving back, and this is what you mentioned now. So what would be the main, probably the main definitive for this period?
So one of the epigraphs for the book comes from Kierkegaard, who said that life is lived forward and understood backwards. So the first thing to say is we don't know. It's a period without a name, whose character we don't yet know. But what is clear is that it's a period in which we recognize that Europe again needs to take military power seriously. So that's what Olaf Scholz with his Zeitenwende, that was the point of Zeitenwende. And therefore, Europe has to think about itself as having that dimension of power, as well as economic power and regulatory power. So I had a fascinating conversation in Kiev last month with Dmytro Kuleba about this notion of liberal empire, that the EU is actually in its way an empire. We all react very strongly against the word empire, but actually a liberal empire, an empire by consent, by democratic consent, a voluntary empire, an empire regulated by law, but nonetheless an empire which, faced with the challenge from Putin's Russia, which is trying to restore the Russian Empire, has to take military force seriously. So that's point number one. Point number two is, I hope this period will be characterized by a new double eastward enlargement of the EU and of NATO. In other words, a new great step forwards towards the great goal of my generation, which is Europe whole and free, right? So we had the first great eastward enlargement, which went from 1990 to about 2007, taking in, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states. And then basically we stopped. The whole thing stopped about 2007, 2008. We had 15 years Croatia slipped in, but otherwise basically it stopped. And now suddenly we have a real commitment from the EU to the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, and potentially Georgia. And that's a huge development in the history of the European project. But of course, the question is, will it be real? Or will it just drag on for years and years and years, as happened with the Western Balkans, without us getting anywhere?
Shortly after the end of the Warsaw Pact, yes, there was the idea of Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And how do you, now of course, as we see, it is rather forgotten, but if we may say and speak about some European elites, do you feel that the modus operandi, so the coexistence with Russia, will be changed or is changed forever?
I don't know about forever. Forever is a very long time, but for a long time to come. So here's the thing. In ending the Cold War, there was a sense in which Western policy had to be Moscow first, because Moscow held the key to the liberation of Eastern Europe, right? So that was a reality. Then you have the post-war period, where we have what I call in the book the enlargement of the West, right? With EU and NATO as the two strong arms of the West. Right? So if you're Estonia or if you're Romania, you want to be in both, right? But we attempted to do that with consent from Moscow. And you know what? It's simply not true to say that we didn't try to get agreement with Moscow, because we did. We went very far to do that. We took Russia into the G7 to make it the G8. And you know what? And I document this. Putin agreed to the eastward enlargement of NATO, which he now denounces. He explicitly agreed to it. I can give you chapter and verse. So that was a second period where we were doing the enlargement of the West, but with some kind of reluctant agreement from Moscow and actually from Putin. Now we have a third period where I hope we're going to go on doing the enlargement of the West. And in the long term, that means for Ukraine, both EU and NATO, although obviously NATO is more difficult. And it's not going to be with the consent of Moscow. That's absolutely clear for the foreseeable future, right? Putin or any likely successor. Long term, of course, we have to think about Russia's place, not just in a pan-European security architecture, but also in a world where countries like China and India and South Africa and Brazil, major non-Western powers, are calling the shots. So in that larger geopolitics, of course, we have to think about Russia. But my own view is that for the next few years, at least until Putin goes and is replaced by someone more reasonable, our Ukraine policy is our Russia policy.
Yeah, I remember you also mentioned this in the lecture concerning the Ukraine policy. Also, there was the other moment which was interesting to me. You said that after this war, Russia's war against Ukraine, Europe might be fully decolonized. I guess you a little bit mentioned, but just once more to state how will this decolonization influence Europe, and how will this Europe, decolonized Europe, will look like?
So isn't it fascinating how empires are still haunting us in different ways? And what I would argue is, if we achieve that next great eastward enlargement, we will be closer than we've ever been before to what I call a post-imperial Europe. That's to say, a Europe which has neither empires overseas, which, remember, we had from the 15th century until very late in the 20th century, right? Angola and Mozambique only got independence in the mid-1970s, Hong Kong, later than that. But also no big empires on land. And of course, the Russian Empire is the last giant European land empire. So I think, however, there's still another bit of decolonization which has to happen, which is what I might call the decolonization of the Western mind. That is to say, until 24th of February 2022, people were still seeing Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, in a way through Russian eyes, subordinated to Russia. And so there's a further process that needs to happen, which is a sort of mental, psychological, cultural decolonization. And then when we've done all that, ironically enough, then we have to build up our own new kind of liberal empire to defend our interests and our values.
Here, just have one additional question, because just recently I was looking into the syllabuses and also how the courses in the big universities changed. And when we speak about the region, I mean, the Eastern Europe, there are some more courses, for example, on Ukraine, but not more, if we say, I don't know, on Belarus or on Moldova or in Georgia. So it looks like, well, I don't like this topic, but that, okay, Ukraine, we are speaking about Ukraine, there will be more about Ukraine, but still less about other countries of the region. So because this, I think this adds up to this decolonization of the mind. How, as a researcher, as a professor, how in your vision this decolonization through knowledge, or knowledge decolonization, should happen, so that it wasn't just because Ukraine, we have war in Ukraine and that's why they're more interested in Ukraine, but towards the region, and these lenses were not biased by any other, as it was like vision on Ukraine and on the whole region biased by Russian vision?
Well, I mean, academic studies have always been affected by politics. So it's nothing new. I mean, when you had the Polish risings in the 19th century, then people suddenly started getting very interested in Poland. And, after 1968, there was a wave of interest in Czechoslovakia. So in a way, that's nothing new. My, in a sense, lifetime's work has been to try and get us to study Europe as a whole and the whole of Europe. Right, both those things. And there are two particular problems in there. One is big countries get much more attention than small countries. So what you say about Ukraine is self-evidently true, but it's also true of Russia, Germany, Poland versus Slovenia, Spain versus Portugal, maybe Britain versus Ireland, right? So there's a kind of intrinsic bias because Europe is actually well over 40 different countries, cultures, languages, histories, and your specialists are going to be specialists in one or two or three, right? So that's point number one, and that's very difficult to get around, although we should try. The other is institutional inertia in academia. So we have this really strange position that more than 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, there is still a subject, a discipline, an area called Russian and East European Studies, right? Where you study everything from Kazakhstan to the Czech Republic under this rubric of Russian and East European studies. I mean, you know, imagine that in 1975, we had programs on German and East European studies because Germany had had an empire there, or I don't know, in 1938, we had Ottoman and East European studies, right? Because the Ottoman Empire was there for a long time. I mean, it's almost as anachronistic as that. But universities change very slowly because there are posts, there are people, there's funding, there are students, and so it goes on. So actually, you know, it's quite a long-term task to change it structurally. I'm glad to say we're about to get, touch wood, a Ukrainian studies program here at Oxford. And that will be a very good beginning. And then I think the way to go is to build this into just all European studies rather than try to slot it under whatever the last empire was.
Yeah, just I will switch to Russia once more. After the full-scale invasion, we read a lot and speak a lot, and there are some comparisons of Russia with Nazi Germany. And in the way, I don't know whether you also somehow see this also in this way, but in a way, there was denazification of Germany. Could there be the deputinization of Russia? And do you see this as possible?
So what a great question. I mean, first of all, you know, for as long as I can remember, people have been comparing this or that bad actor in Europe to Adolf Hitler. And for as long as I can remember, it's been wrong. It's been hyperbole. I say in the book, and I think this is true, for the first time with Vladimir Putin's full-scale war against Ukraine, the comparison is appropriate because it's both the scale and the brutality and the genocidal intent, right? So you could say Slobodan Milosevic in his way was a little Hitler, but it was on a much smaller scale and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a nuclear-armed superpower. So that's point number one. Point number two, look, Richard von Weizsäcker, the famous West German president, gave a speech in 1985, 40 years after the end of the Second World War, when he said, listen, guys, the best thing that happened to us was defeat, right? The defeat was our liberation. It was, we built everything that we have built in terms of a prosperous, successful liberal democracy was built on that defeat. And so in a way, I'm going to say that the Russian tragedy, not just a Ukrainian and European tragedy, but the Russian tragedy is that Russia can't be defeated in the fundamental sense that Germany was in 1945, because that would be the foundations on which Russia itself could think again and rebuild a better Russia. But because this is the first time in history that we have a major declining empire which has nuclear weapons, it's not going to happen. And therefore, you know, I totally support the special tribunal. I support the idea of instituting the crime of aggression, of trial in absentia. I support all of that. But it's not going to end for the foreseeable future like Yugoslavia, where Milosevic was in front of The Hague and Radovan Karadzic, by the way, is now in a British prison. Unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, it's not. And so one thing I want to say, I think I mentioned this too when we talked in Lviv, is I think it'd be very helpful to think also, not instead of, but also about something like an international truth commission. You know, in South Africa, after the apartheid dictatorship, they said, if we can't have justice, at least we can have truth. I've just put a question into polling done by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, KIS, on precisely this question. And you'll see in the polling in a couple of days' time, there's very strong support for the notion of an international truth commission, as well as judicial accountability.
Thank you. Also, sometimes when I think whether Russia could have been stopped before, also thinking about the interwar periods and whether white hegemony was not stopped then. May I ask you this as a historian, why?
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, every analogy will only take you so far. No analogy is perfect, but nonetheless, I think in this case, 2014 was the turning point at which the West failed to turn. That was a moment. Up to that point, it was entirely reasonable to think that you should try and continue with diplomacy and negotiation and so on, even in spite of what happened in Georgia. But after that point, we made the mistake of the policy called appeasement, which was the policy of Britain and France towards Nazi Germany in the 1930s, which at the time was thought to be a good thing, because appeasement meant simply trying to bring peace. But we made that through the Minsk negotiations, through continued, energy dependence on Russia, through giving insufficient warning to Russia about what would happen, failing to arm Ukraine sufficiently, allowing the dirty Russian money to swill around Londongrad and other cities. All of that clearly sent the wrong signals to Moscow. So I think there's a major historical reckoning, and I think the analogy with appeasement goes quite a long way. And by the way, here's the last irony. Chancellor Angela Merkel, who of course has an important part in this story, was obsessed by a book by a very fine Cambridge historian called Christopher Clark, which was called Sleepwalkers. And it was how people sleptwalked into the First World War. And she was obsessed with avoiding that danger. And the irony is that, obsessed so she was with sleepwalking, she actually sleepwalked into the Great War in Ukraine.
Oh, that's interesting. I've seen articles of German politicians mentioning this book already when the full-scale invasion started even. So yes, that's a huge irony. And my last question is about not just about the Europe, but about the whole world. We see also through the polls the bigger divide between the global South and global North. And do you see the reason and like the attitude towards Russia's war against Ukraine is one of the issues in this divide, as I see. Do you see any opportunity to bridge this divide and to find the issues that may unite the world?
So I think you're referring to the opinion polling that my Oxford project, Oxford University project on Europe in a Changing World did with the European Council on Foreign Relations, which was absolutely fascinating and which showed the West is more united, Europe closer to the US, but more divided from, quote unquote, the rest, China, India, Turkey, and Russia, obviously. Radically different. China, India, Turkey stop the war, even if it means Ukraine giving up a lot of its territory. And then you dig a bit deeper, and what you find is that, for example, India and Turkey have quite a positive view of the US, quite a positive view of the EU, quite a positive view of Britain, and a positive view of Russia, right? Particularly in India, this is very clear. And they think Russia is emerging stronger from the war. Now, that seems quite shocking and surprising to us, but seen from their point of view, they are just new great powers, right? New great powers with no particular attachment to the West, not just swing states to be wooed over to the side of the West. By the way, not just part of some undifferentiated, quote unquote, global South, a term I think we should ban, because it is a way itself brings a kind of colonial thinking. There's us in our strong countries in the North, and then the global South, poor things, who we have to win over. So I think, to answer your question, two ways forward. One is, I think you as Ukrainians have the credibility bought in blood to say to Indians, look, this is a war of independence against a war of recolonization by Russia. To describe it as decolonization. If I say that as a Brit to the Indians, it doesn't sound so great, because after all, Britain was the former colonial power. So it's rather like I don't know, a Russian talking about decolonization, right? But if you say it, I think that has credibility. The other way to do it, Olga, is to recognize that that's how they see themselves. They see themselves as great powers, as to great empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Indian Empire, who have their own interests. And then instead of talking about, you know, values and the West and democracy, you say, okay, what are your interests? What are our interests? And where do our interests actually coincide? And so oddly enough, moving from the language of values and a sort of new Cold War between democracy and autocracy, like Joe Biden in Warsaw, to a much sort of calmer, more sober language of interests, treating each of these countries individually, right? India is India, Turkey is Turkey. They're not just some global south. I think we might get further.
Thank you. Thank you so much.